What if the biggest risk for XRP investors isn't missing the next rally, but believing the story they're being told right now? Because if you've been watching the markets lately, you've probably noticed something strange. One day it's fear, the next day it's optimism. One headline says rates are staying high, another suggests the exact opposite. One week everyone says regulation is dead, the next week they're talking like it's inevitable. So the real question is this: are investors reacting to reality, or are they reacting to a narrative? And later in this video, we'll talk about why many XRP investors believe the Clarity Act is still on track, why some analysts think XRP may be sitting in a major reversal zone, and why understanding market psychology could be one of the most important skills you develop before the next big move. Now, here's what's interesting. For a long time, many people have argued that what we're seeing in financial markets is far more coordinated than most investors realize. Every major headline seems perfectly timed. Every major market reaction feels predictable. And nowhere does that seem more obvious than in the digital asset space. Because let's be honest, crypto has always carried a certain narrative around it. People say it's risky, people say it's difficult to understand, people say it's speculative. And while retail investors are busy reacting emotionally to every headline, the biggest players in the world seem to be operating on an entirely different level. That's why many investors continue paying attention to one thing above everything else: behavior. Not words, not headlines, behavior. Because behavior often reveals what people truly believe. And right now, despite all the fear and uncertainty, there are still major conversations happening around XRP. Price predictions are everywhere. Some analysts are talking about timelines. Others are discussing potential catalysts. And while nobody knows exactly what will happen, one thing is clear. A growing number of experienced market watchers believe XRP may be approaching an important turning point. Now, this isn't about making predictions. It's about understanding what analysts are actually seeing. Names like Dark Defender, eGrad Crypto, CoinsKid, Blockchain Backer, and others have all pointed towards similar signals recently. According to many of them, XRP has entered levels that historically have been associated with oversold conditions. They're looking at indicators like momentum, relative strength, historical patterns, and long-term market structure. And while technical analysis is never guaranteed, many of these analysts believe the market may be much closer to a reversal than most investors realize. But here's where it gets interesting. At the same time analysts are talking about oversold conditions, the broader market continues reacting to economic headlines. Interest rates, inflation, economic outlooks, Federal Reserve commentary. Every statement seems to move markets instantly. Recently, comments from economic policymakers created another wave of uncertainty. Suddenly, investors started talking about higher rates, more tightening, more pressure on risk assets. And yet, many investors remain skeptical. Because they've seen this movie before. They've seen markets panic over headlines, they've seen narratives change overnight, and they've seen the final outcome look very different from what people expected at the beginning. That's why some investors believe the current environment is creating confusion rather than clarity. And when confusion dominates, opportunities often appear where people least expect them. Now, does that mean every prediction will come true? Absolutely not. But it does mean investors should pay attention to what's happening behind the scenes rather than focusing only on the daily news cycle. Because while headlines change every day, some larger trends continue moving forward. And one of those trends is regulation. For years, the crypto industry has been waiting for greater regulatory clarity. For years, institutions have been preparing infrastructure. For years, companies have been building products they couldn't fully deploy until clearer rules arrived. And despite all the debate, many investors remain convinced that regulatory clarity is eventually coming. In fact, some believe it is not a question of if, but when. Because when you look around the world, preparations are already happening. Financial institutions are discussing tokenization. Governments are exploring digital asset frameworks. Banks are experimenting with blockchain solutions. And major organizations continue discussing the future of tokenized financial markets. So here's the question: why would all this preparation be happening if the destination wasn't already clear? That's the argument many XRP supporters continue making. They believe tokenization is coming. They believe institutional adoption is coming. And they believe the financial industry is preparing for that future right now. Not 5 years from now, not 10 years from now, right now. And that's why many investors continue watching developments surrounding the Clarity Act so closely. Because they believe regulation could become one of the biggest catalysts for the next phase of adoption. But that's not the part most investors are talking about. Because once institutions finally have the green light to participate more aggressively, an entirely different conversation begins. And that's exactly what we're going to talk about next. But that's not the part most investors are talking about. Because once institutions finally get the clarity they've been waiting for, an entirely different conversation begins. And that conversation is all about liquidity. Take a look at what we're seeing with major IPOs and institutional investments today. A lot of attention has been focused on companies like SpaceX, where large institutional funds and pension plans are pouring in billions of dollars. But here's the question many investors never ask. Who is selling? Because every buyer needs a seller, and in many cases, the biggest winners are the early private investors who got in years before the public ever had a chance. They're the ones taking profits after seeing massive gains. Meanwhile, institutions and pension funds step in for the long-term hold. Now, why does that matter for XRP? Because many investors believe a similar dynamic could eventually play out across digital assets once regulatory clarity arrives. If large institutions begin allocating capital into this space, somebody will eventually become the liquidity on the other side of those trades. And that's why understanding market cycles is so important. Here's where a lot of people get caught off guard. Some investors imagine XRP moving higher and simply never looking back. $100, $300, $1,000, maybe even higher. But history tells us something very different. Every bull market has corrections. Every rally has pullbacks. Every major cycle creates both opportunity and emotion. And that's why strategy matters just as much as conviction. Because if generational wealth opportunities do arrive, the real question becomes, what are you going to do when they arrive? Most people spend years thinking about buying. Very few spend time thinking about selling. And that's a mistake many investors make. Because when markets become emotional, decisions become difficult. That's why many experienced investors constantly emphasize doing your own research. Not because they don't want to help, but because conviction borrowed from somebody else usually disappears the moment the market gets volatile. Real confidence comes from understanding why you own something in the first place. It comes from asking questions, studying the market, looking at the data yourself, and building a thesis that can survive both good news and bad news. But here's another point that many XRP holders completely overlook. What happens when the market finally moves faster than expected? Think about it. Many people keep their assets on major exchanges: Coinbase, Kraken, Uphold, Robinhood. And while these platforms work well most of the time, crypto veterans know exactly what happens during major market events. Volume explodes, servers get overwhelmed, logins slow down, transactions take longer, and suddenly the entire market is trying to do the same thing at the exact same time. Now imagine spending years building a position. Imagine finally seeing prices reach levels you've dreamed about, and then being unable to access your account when it matters most. That's why many experienced investors constantly talk about preparing before the opportunity arrives, instead of waiting until it arrives. Because when markets move in crypto, they don't always move slowly. Sometimes they move in hours. Sometimes they move in days. And sometimes they move when almost nobody expects it. That's why having a plan matters. Having off-ramps matters. Having a strategy matters. And most importantly, staying emotionally prepared matters. Because whether XRP reaches the target some analysts are discussing or not, one thing is becoming increasingly clear. The conversation around regulation isn't going away. The conversation around tokenization isn't going away. The conversation around institutional adoption isn't going away. In fact, many believe we're getting closer to those conversations becoming reality. And if that happens, the investors who are prepared may be in a much stronger position than those who wait until the headlines tell them it's safe. At the end of the day, nobody knows exactly when the next major move will happen. But many investors believe the groundwork is already being laid. The key is staying informed, staying disciplined, and staying ready for whatever comes next. If you enjoyed today's update, make sure to subscribe, turn on notifications, and join us for more XRP news and analysis right here on XRP Update. And remember, the biggest opportunities often appear when the majority of people are looking the other way.